with a near-deafening crack made absolutely everybody flinch. All lights in the building came back on. Everybody stumbled for a second, shielding their eyes from the sudden assault of light after having gotten used to the darkness. After a few seconds of blinking, they got comfortable enough to open their eyes and stand up straight again. James also used the opportunity to push himself off of Konglodge, who had so far provided him support, considering James had barely been able to walk in a straight line after being exposed to the sedative gas. Also, somebody needed to keep him from wandering off in the darkness, as his concentration had severely plummeted after a good bit of his adrenaline died down. "Back with us?" the armoured giant asked, looking down at James with two of his still slightly squinted eyes. "Yeah, I can walk by myself now," James replied, trying to rub some of the haziness out of his eyes. "Thank you for the help." As the sudden re-emergence of the facility's electricity had given them all pause anyway, they subconsciously decided to take a short break before continuing, shaking out their arms and legs, and getting their minds in order in relative safety. With the effects of the gas slowly coming to an end within his system, feeling returned to James's body, and with it came pain. He reached around, painfully rubbing the pierced, burnt, bruised, or otherwise injured areas of his skin. Until now, he hadn't even noticed how much punishment he had actually taken in that skirmish. He had been so numb. The pain wasn't yet debilitating. However, it was certainly worse than unpleasant. He gritted his teeth and tried to ignore it, looking around, his brain telling him to avoid looking to his left for at least one more moment. He first looked up towards his gigantic partner in crime. Luckily, the Lizardor had not suffered the same fate as him, and looked like there wasn't a scratch on him. Playing possum had worked out for the guy. Apparently a reptilian's slow metabolism could really be a blessing every now and then. "Do you think they're going to try and lock us in?" Konglodge asked, his voice already sounding all business again. Most of his eyes had started to independently scan the now lit-up room, taking it in its entirety. Only one's fiery gaze was still locked downwards onto James. James shook his head, to both answer in the negative and try to clear some remnants of drowsiness from behind his eyes. "I don't know, but I don't think they can," he replied, not quite as confident as he wanted to. "Don't think they have the codes for that. If I had to guess, they probably have to vent the room before anyone gets brain damage, but we're probably on camera again, or at least will be shortly, so we should be careful." In his periphery, he could see a blurry silhouette move, pulling something from her head. He took deep breaths. With each time, his lungs filled and emptied with fresh air, at least as fresh as it got in a building within a space station. He regained more and more of his senses, always surprised how much had still been locked away. He counted seconds with each breath. 4 in, 4 out. When he felt his head was clear, and also that he couldn't stall any longer, he turned to his left, involuntarily running a hand through his messy hair and getting it out of his face as he did so. He really needed a haircut. With an audible rustle, Shida shook out her wild mane of hair, holding his breath filter in both hands in front of her chest, his tinted window reflecting the corridor like a mirror in the light. His still agitatedly beating heart felt like it had hesitated for a moment. Either noticing him in her periphery, or feeling his gaze on her, she glanced over for a second before completely turning in his direction. The two Deathworlders stared at each other for a moment without saying anything. Then Shida extended both arms, thrusting the breath filter in his direction, with probably a bit more force than necessary, holding it with outstretched arms and waiting for James to react. Her face and eyes were reddened, the remnants of emotion taking physical effect not quite yet vanished from her visage. James didn't dare comment on it though. "Right," James said, mostly to try and rip himself out of his stupor, as his voice was the first thing he got back under control. Then he quickly reached out and grabbed the mask out of her hand, wedging it under his arm to hold it. Shida then averted her eyes and started fidgeting with something attached to her hip. Looking down, James noticed only now that it was his Martian Marmaluke that she had apparently either gotten or taken back from Reprieg. Apparently not wanting to remain saying absolutely nothing, Shida slowly started to speak, just mumbling something inane. "So what do we do now?" she asked, as the sheath weapon seemed determined to be difficult to remove from his holstering. "Don't know," James replied, just happy to have anything to say. "Didn't think things would go this far, to be honest." "Well, what was your plan?" Shida asked again, finally yanking the sheath free with a strong jerk of her arm. "Well, plan is pushing it a bit. Establish control no matter what, then see where things go from there. I hate to say it, but it seems I am my mother's son after all," James admitted embarrassedly, trailing off as he reached for the polished weapon, thoughtlessly admiring it for a moment, once he held it in his hands again. "No idea what I'm going to use this for now, but I'm sure it will come in handy." Somehow, it was a weirdly reassuring feeling having the piece of human over-engineering in his possession again, even though he was a lot better with the much deadlier weapon strapped to his belt loops right now. Shida and himself had seemingly come to the subconscious agreement that they wouldn't look each other directly in the eyes for the moment. He didn't even know why. Shouldn't this be the time when they had no problems? For now we should keep going, James finally decided, as doing nothing was not only costing them precious time, but also made the awkwardness in the air gain in weight. He didn't get a direct agreement, however Shida soon started to move on, so apparently she was okay with that. James and Konglosh followed. They stayed close to the walls and checked each corner before they turned it, as they couldn't be sure if reinforcements had been sent into the building already. It was quite possible that trying to remain sneaky was entirely in vain, as there was a good chance that the surveillance of the building was already up and running again, but it gave them something to do, instead of just plainly gallivanting around. Suddenly, a low rumble from behind James was trying to get his attention.
"So, are we okay with her just appearing like that?"
Konglosh whispered, his low voice hardly carrying through the barren room.
"With her flip-flopping size like this, what is to say she isn't still a danger to us?"
James threw a look over his shoulder, up at the giant, whose intense eyes lit down on him. "The hell are you whispering for?" he asked in a dismissive manner. "If I can hear you, she for sure can as well." Shida's ears gave a brief twitch, almost as if to confirm his statement.
"Well, then answer loudly if you prefer it," Konglosh replied indignantly. "My question still stands."
James growled in irritation. "She's fine," he said, emphasizing that was the end of it with a stern tone. "And what about you? Who are you even?" Shida shot back, showing James that this clearly was not the end of it. And although that was technically a justified question, he wasn't going to let it stand any more than that of his Lisador accomplice. "He's also fine," he said, irritated, and held his head with one hand. "Listen, can we not do this right now?" Konglosh's answer consisted of a dismissive hiss. If James had to interpret it, he would take it as a "I'll play along, but this isn't over" kind of hiss. "Fine," Shida said, and now finally turned her head to take part in the conversation instead of just blankly talking forward. "But just for the record, I never flip-flop sides. I was just trying to play my cards right." Hearing that, James immediately loudly exhaled through his nose, as he didn't manage to completely hide his reaction. "What?" Shida asked shrilly, turning her face and ears towards him. Her sharp yellow eyes now met his for the first time since they had parted ways before this craziness started. It wasn't as bad as he had imagined. In fact, in that very moment, a huge weight seemingly dropped off of him, and he couldn't even explain why. However, that didn't stop him from using the unexpected burst of energy. "Shida, treasure, light of my life. We both know that that's not fucking true," he said, trying to sound serious but bursting into a chuckle. "I know someone trying to play both sides when I see them." Shida almost unnoticeably recalled the tiniest bit, and her eyes opened wide. Had she been human, James expected that she would probably be blushing. "Well, so what? That doesn't mean I switched sides," she explained, seeming hesitant to mirror James's amused tone. "I was on your side. Simple as that. Nothing says I can't check if you are sure about what side you're on. Don't tell me you've actually doubted me." "I did, very much so," James replied, without a second's hesitation. "That's fair," Shida immediately responded. Then the two Deathworlders broke into a brief bout of laughter. Konglosh looked at the display with relative awe, apparently deciding to not even try to say anything on the matter. As they didn't make any further unnecessary pit stops, they advanced through the building quite quickly, and, led by Shida, reconvened with the other half of the group, although maybe James shouldn't count the hostages to their number. Seeing a gentle soul like Curie hold people at gunpoint was, in a way, both hilarious and heartbreaking. Something about them awkwardly holding the weapon, with the tubes of their backward leg looking just a little bit too out of place for the tragedy of the situation to really sink in, though. However, none of that was enough to overshadow the first impulse, aggressively digging its way out of the recesses of James's mind, and not stopping for anything, not even common sense. Abandoning all caution, reservation, and previous knowledge of the person he was interacting with, James burst forward, even pushing past Shida, and in no more than 2 enormous leaping steps, he had crossed the space between the cyborg and himself, was throwing himself at their metal body, wrapping his arms around them any way he could, without being pushed away by their legs. In fact, he collided with their hard surface with such force that he felt his skin and tissue protest, and he was almost sure that he had just bruised himself by basically battering his face against a metal plate, but he didn't care. He just held on, locking his arms and pressing his face against the unmoving metal. The only thing that finally convinced him to move was a faint whine right next to his ear. "James!" Curie softly complained, and James had to admit he knew exactly why. He just had to be selfish for a second there. Right, sorry, he apologized, losing his tight grip and stepping away from the cyborg again. Feeling something on his face, he reached up and wiped some moisture from his eyes. He didn't know if his eyes were tearing from having banged his face against a wall, or if he had just started to tear up without noticing, and he didn't really care. You're okay, right? Everything where it's supposed to be? I'm unharmed, James, Kira replied calmly, if so a bit shaken by James's sudden hug assault. They couldn't have harmed me if they tried. Was that just... Never mind. Hey, where's my heartfelt reunion? She'd commented from behind James, causing him to perk up. You already had yours, he said, his voice slightly becoming stricter as he spoke. Also, you don't get any. After all, you dragged them into this. Why did you take them out of the hive? He turned on his heels to sternly look at the feline. Well, they wouldn't have been protected there for long. The orders I received made it pretty clear that the embassies aren't quite so safe. At least not for them, she explained herself, standing tall against James's accusing tone. Then she crossed her arms and turned the tide on him. Why did you try to kidnap a bunch of people? Well, she got him there. Truth was, he panicked, and in said panic he defaulted back to his trained tactics, even though he should have known that he lacked the willingness, or maybe more precisely, the conviction, to actually pull them off. He had done the thing that you should never do. He half-assed two things, and it had cost him. In hindsight, he should have either stayed away from any attention, and just tried to sneak by, or fully committed, letting the murder programming somewhere still inside him take over, and just shoot when and who he had to shoot. Luckily, in the first good deed he had probably ever done in his life as far as James was concerned, Reprieve saved him from actually having to spell that out to Shida. Spare me your quarrelling and your love banter, please, the warrant officer pressed out in annoyance, while sitting leaned against the wall, apparently having gotten apathetic about weapons being pointed at him quite quickly, which wasn't too surprising for someone in his position. James looked at the man for a moment. One thing that surprised him was that the Sipper's Leng actually seemed to let Sky somewhat hide behind him, as she seemed less thrilled about the topic of being threatened, even though it was clear that she wasn't trying to let it show. Apparently, Need built bridges, even in the unlikeliest of places. Not that doing something barely decent spoke much in favour of Reprieve, but James had to admit that the display somewhat, to the tiniest degree, lessened the cocktail of disdain and contempt bubbling up within him. Not to a significant degree, though. Just enough that he didn't feel the want to shoot the man on sight. You know what? Thinking about it? James then loudly announced, turning around and power-walking over to Shida, taking small, deliberate steps this time. You're right, this is overdue. Come here, you beautiful beast. Leaning so much into his display that he even dropped the mask he was still carrying under his arm, he sought to surprise Shida off her feet, twirling her around him like a dancer would his partner for a moment, before holding her suspended in his arms, and leaning down to plant a needlessly extensive kiss on her face, which she bravely endured, possibly also because she was earnestly surprised by his abrupt action. She didn't seem to dislike it all too much, though. Despite Reprieve not giving him the satisfaction of actually audibly reacting to his exceedingly obvious provocation, James liked to imagine that he could hear the rodent groan in his thoughts.
That's all very nice, but we're running out of time to waste.
Conglorge, who had taken position, blocking the massive doorway leading into the comparatively small room, commented.
We need to decide what to do now. In fact, we might already have problems getting out of here, so unless we have a set destination, it may be a fool's errand to do so.
James looked up at his unlikely ally. He had put the Tornastrosite through a lot already. In fact, they had all been through a lot. And due to his own plain stupidity, he had messed up quite spectacularly, putting them all into it neck deep. To some, it may have seemed like he had come out ahead in that last encounter, but he knew better. Plain and simple, he had just bitten off way more than he could chew, and he only noticed after he had started choking. In fact, he was almost sure that Conglorge's assessment was correct. With everyone on their tail, it would be a fool's errand to try and get out of here. But what if they didn't have everyone on their tail? Now, it was time to make things right. James pulled Shida back on her feet and took a step away from her. In one smooth motion, he pulled out one of the firearms he carried, aimed, and fired. With a single shot, he had taken out the camera he had previously used himself to observe this very room. The impact of the projectile left it in pieces. Then he looked up to the giant predator, with the most earnest expression he could muster. Do you think you can manage to get to your ship in a reasonable time? Where is it stationed? He asked, in a matter-of-fact way. The armored titan tilted his head, and in a rare occasion, all of his eyes focused on James at the same time.
If we had a shuttle, sure, he replied, with a growling undertone. But I doubt they'll open any shuttle bays if we're so much as near them. And that is not even mentioning the dock itself. Besides, without a crew.
You have a crew, James interrupted him, having heard what he needed to hear. You said you needed a co-pilot and a mechanic in order to not die. Well, here's your co-pilot and here's your mechanic. He gestured towards Shada and Curie with those comments. His friends looked back at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. Shada's face specifically turned grim, and he guessed she was already starting to see where he was going with this. He didn't know if the same was true for Curie, as their unmoving face of course allowed him no insight into their thoughts. Despite the clear shift of mood in the room, James continued his speech undeterred. Granted, Shada was used to piloting much bigger ships with bigger crews, and Curie works more on drones than on ships with passengers, but I'm sure they'll manage in a pinch. And don't you worry about those doors. I'll get them open for you. This time, no matter what, he added in his mind. As he had been speaking, something in his mind had clicked, was now locked in place. While the whole situation seemed to be all about him, this, right now, wasn't about him, and he couldn't treat it like it was. He only now realized that somehow, in the strangest way, he'd actually let the matriarch and her place at his ego get to him. Not in the way she wanted, but still. She had got him to actually believe this was about him. Talk about hubris. With that, he not only regained the balance of his mind, it was now more firm than ever. James, you can't be serious, Shada said. She seemed a lot more horrified at this than she was at the prospect of talking to him while he pointed a gun at her and dozens of innocent people. I am, he replied calmly. You can't be the one to go, she insisted, stepping forward, her ears standing straight up and her tail agitatedly swinging. James remained rooted in place. Actually, I'm the only one who can, simply on the merit that I'm the one they're not shooting at, he explained with a faint chuckle. Besides, I'm neither a co-pilot nor a mechanic, and Conglorch never mentioned needing a microbiologist for a ship to run. But you're... Shada started, but James interrupted her, more sternly this time. I am the one they want, which means if they're after me, they hopefully won't care enough to seriously chase after you. So if you keep your heads down, you might make it to your destination without any big altercations, while I lead them away from you. He explained his thought process. Of course, a little bit of that was wishful thinking. After all, they were all wanted people now. However, maybe he would actually manage to push the right buttons and take most of the heat off of everyone else. Seeing Shada's face fall into a deep gloom, James flashed her a smile. He said, Hey, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to skip out on you. Once I have that door open, I'll be coming right after you. It'd be pretty bad if I just let myself be caught after all this, wouldn't it? Do you promise? Shada asked him outright. Oh, I hate making promises, James responded, waving it off. You'll just have to take my word for it. Shada's eyes narrowed onto him. Her face was almost expressionless for a moment, no muscle moving any part of it apart from that narrowed gaze. Then she completely closed her eyes and loudly exhaled out of her nose. I'll hold you to that, she said. But James, you can't go alone, Curie suddenly chimed in, protesting from their position further inside the room. James turned towards them surprised, but his expression quickly shifted to a gently smile, as he replied, Don't worry, I won't. Those two will come with me. With that, he gestures over towards the apathetic Reprieg and the cowering sky. Curie seemed to need a moment to process what he had just said. However, Reprieg was quick to find his tongue, snarkily replying, And what if we don't want to? He lazily looked up at James, seemingly challenging him for the sake of it, instead of out of any real desire to do so. James threw Reprieg an ice-cold stare, and when he then said, If you think I have any inhibitions about shooting you, like I did with my previous hostages, you are severely misunderstanding your position. He meant it. That privilege had run out, for both of them. Skye, on the other hand, he would probably just let run along. He doubted that she had any part left to play in this. The message seemed to sink in with Reprieg. The warrant officer didn't react in his usual fearful way that James knew from making eye contact with him in the past. His reaction was something more meaningful. A cold acceptance, manifesting right in the man's eyes. Even beyond species barriers, it was impossible to miss. Are you really sure about this, Dancer? Conglorch asked from over James's shoulder. How often had he asked him that already? Maybe just once, but it felt like a lot more. I am, James replied, without turning to him. Sudden footsteps behind him made him listen up. Well, if that's the case, give me your computer thingy real quick, Shada commanded, sauntering up to him. I need to make a call. I would use my assistant, but, well... She indicated towards the pitiful remains of what must once have been the mentioned device. Who are you going to contact? Curie asked inquisitively, turning their head to look at the feline, while James complied and handed over his phone. The Rushgak, Shada replied. I asked them to pack our things for us, so we could be ready to go. We're probably going to need everything we can get our hands on, so I'll ask them to bring them to the shuttle ramp. Wow, what service, James commented jokingly. As he allowed himself to slightly relax while waiting for Shida to make her call, his hand inadvertently sank down onto the hilt of the sword, now proudly displayed at his hips. Once it did, his eyes wandered downward, onto the mask he had dropped earlier. He bent down, picking it up and staring into the dark eyes of his own reflection in his tinted window, while listening to the brief exchange of words she had with their hosts. "That should be taken care of," she mumbled, and let out a strained sigh, reaching out to hand James back his phone. "Keep it," James said, reaching out and grabbing the phone, only to make a few quick changes to its settings, and then giving it back to her. "You might need it more than me. I've unlocked it so you won't be bothered with the password, but take good care of it. Lots of important stuff on there." It takes a second for Sheeta to accept the gadget again, and store it in her pockets. "If you say so," she said. In the meantime, James's eyes had fallen back down to the mask, and his thoughts had gone back to the sword. He didn't know if he would get to ask, if he didn't do it right now. Why these two things? It bubbled out of him before he could think better of it. "Pardon?" Sheeta asked, perking up, confused from his sudden question. "And of all my stuff, why did you bring these two things with you?" James elaborated on his question, feeling that it was too late to go back on it now. "Oh, that?" Sheeta said, her eyes now also becoming stuck on the mask in James's hands. "Well, for the mask, I thought you might need it. A human without one tends to stick out after all, so I felt like it would be good to bring it to you just in case. Also helped me with having to try and look tough so damn hard. And the sword? Well, it somehow seemed important, maybe just because of the way you reacted to it. It felt wrong to just leave it." "Is that so?" James said. Then everyone fell silent for a moment, before James spoke up once more. "Actually, I have one more question," he stated. "And what's that?" Sheeta replied openly. "What exactly was in those orders you got from the matriarch?" James inquired. His mind was telling him he needed that information. He needed that closure. Sheeta let out a voiceless breath, then a few more. It seemed to take her a moment to bring it over her lips, and James didn't know if that was mostly because she was talking to him. Something along the lines of, "Petty Officer Sheeta, I've noticed your struggle of climbing in the ranks. You don't have to worry about it anymore, because this is your biggest assignment yet. Get the ambassador to see reason. If you succeed, your career is secured, and you won't have to worry about money and status ever again. And also, while you're at it, be a dear and save me a phone call. Round out that pesky cyborg and make sure it is under control. Don't let it get away again," she related with a glum expression, her ears beginning to hang and her gaze lowering even further as she spoke. "I asked the Brushgak. Why I would have protection in the Hive, they wouldn't be willing to shelter someone strange to the Hive, like Curie, from someone as powerful as the Leader Supreme. Curie would be given no sanctuary. And no, they also couldn't have just rented a room after the fact. I've asked. When she said I was merely saving her a phone call, I believe she meant that." James didn't really answer. He just nodded his head. The silence in the room became palpable. Finally, James decided. "All right, that was enough wasting time. I'm going to grow roots if I wait here any longer, and the defenses outside probably won't get any lighter either. You guys best take the rest of Sky's gizmos and gadgets with you. They can be really handy." Taking a page out of Sheeta's book, James lifted the mask and put on his breath filter. He had not worn it in a while, but it still felt familiar. But there was a new smell to it now. And then he once again drew one of the firearms. Well, as he indicated for their hostages to start moving, to which they complied without protest. "I'm sure you know where those pesky doors are being controlled at, don't you, Reprig?" James asked, as seen as the warrant officer was of the same height as him, his voice crackling in the ears from the masked amplifier. Reprig surprised him, looking him right in the face for a moment before he answered. "So you actually wanted to go into the middle of Granvia's circle?" The rodent first countered his question with a question. James grinned, exposing his teeth very deliberately. "Right into the belly of the beast," he replied. "Or the lion's den if you want to be more traditional. We're making a break for it." Reprig managed to hold his confident demeanour. "Then I wouldn't be doing my job if I tried to stop you. Let's go," he replied, starting to walk towards the hatch in the floor, leading to the labyrinth of maintenance tunnels underneath. But James just laughed. "Where are you going? We're not using that way." Reprig turned on his heels, looking back at James, and even a little bit of his usually done with you already attitude seemed to return for a moment. "We aren't?" he asked, with a mixture of surprise and a hint of disdain for whatever James was planning. "You aren't?" all of James's companions asked shortly after, sounding about as dumbfounded as the hostage. James shook his head. "Those tunnels are your best bet of making it out of here without a fight, if you can use them to sneak past the commotion," he said confidently. Glances were exchanged between his accomplices. "But won't they be painfully aware that we will try to do that?" asked Conglorge, who seemed to be the first who was willing to challenge James on that. James nodded. "Of course they are," he replied. They will be absolutely expecting us to be using those tunnels to try and escape, which is why I will not be doing that. He made a step forward, reaching out and grabbing Reprieve by one of his thin, hairy arms, pulling him along the direction of the corridor. We're using the front door. Security forces are on the scene and trying to get control over the situation. However, they cannot carelessly approach, as the last audible shot was fired only moments ago and seemed to come from one of the building's more outdoor areas, meaning that the culprits are armed and on the move. According to unofficial statements from anonymous security personnel, security is expecting them to look around for alternative, secretive exits they can use to make an unnoticed escape, or at least one with less resistance. Therefore, guards and even military personnel are currently spreading out, securing every known exit and entrance to the building. Not even an hour ago, security started evacuating injured and unconscious employees from the building. The cause of their ailments is still not officially stated, and military personnel are currently suppressing any attempt at trying to make contact with any of the people that are presumed to be freed hostages from the situation inside. In fact, a lot of manpower appears to be needed just to keep onlookers and curious passers-by from entering the area around the building. That is not only presumed to be dangerous, but also desperately needed for the rescue to proceed smoothly. Behind me, even now, you can still see... Wait, what is that? Right as I speak, some sort of commotion appears to be erupting and... BANG! Goodness, was that another shot? It sounded so close, BANG! What are you doing? Get down for goodness sake! This has been Dwashi Gretchelem for 10 to 10 News. We are currently under fire. We will, hey, let go of me! Yeah, we will keep you updated on the situation from a safe distance. For now, back to the studio. On the camera feed, still focused on the chaotic scene, the news crew was falling back from. Small figures could be seen bursting out of the building, although they near instantly disappeared into the wildly scattering crowd. The security response was severely hampered by the sheer volume of civilians who had wanted to gawk at the spectacle, despite their best efforts to keep them at a manageable distance. Some of the previous hostages were also still being carried out of the building, meaning they and their rescuers were right in the thick of things as everything happened, complicating things even further. As the figures used the cover of a much larger and much slower people around them to try and disappear, some of the activated military personnel got a brief glimpse at them before they vanished behind the next body or obstacle. Weren't there some familiar faces running there? Where the hell are you going? That's a dead end! Reprieve yelled out, as James was trying to coax him in the direction of one of the walkways leading to a railway station. No, it's not, James yelled back, looking around for a moment, trying to see if he could locate Sky anywhere. And in a turn of events surprising exactly no one, she had immediately scattered in the chaos, taken off away from her captor. Not for us. The only reason he even thought to look for Sky was because he was once again going to steal one of her tricks. This time it was the one he had never even seen, because he had managed to stop it before it happened during their first meeting. Back then he had wondered why she would willingly try to corner herself while trying to escape. Now he knew. Ignoring all the points at which it was possible to take off over one of the many suspended walkways, James trod the incline all the way up to the top. As he and Reprieve reached the platform, causing the people already there to recoil from the armed man with bated breaths, James quickly looked around. It had to be here somewhere. See, I told you it was a dead end, Reprieve reprimanded him, irritated, before sighing and shaking out his head. But it makes my job easier. There, James suddenly yelled out, as his eyes had found what he had been looking for. He raised a hand and pointed in the direction, causing Reprieve to confusedly turn and follow his indication. You can't be serious, that would be suicide, the Sippers then cried out, recoiling from the mere thought of what James was insinuating. I have the gun, so not doing it kills you a lot more certainly, and a lot faster, James exclaimed loudly, reminding Reprieve of his firearm with a few harsh gestures in his direction. Now go! Hesitantly, but hurried along by the insistent primate, Reprieve approached one of the platform's sides, where it was directly connected to one of the large supporting pillars, making up the framework that kept all those walkways as well as the railway and the platform itself suspended. Luckily it wasn't smooth, but large screws and deep bridges were built into it. Despite it looking rather steep, James knew the climb would be no problem for the warrant officer. He knew the perks of hailing from a super high gravity world. Make sure not to touch any of the high voltage cables. I'm pretty sure they aren't insulated, James commented, while climbing up behind the man. A grumble was his answer. All the while, the people standing on the platform, as well as the security guards that had managed to keep their trail so far, were gawking at the display for what must have been sheer madness of them. Pulling himself up quickly and barely noticing his own weight while holding onto the tiniest raise or narrowest gap, James scaled the pillar in no time. Which direction? James asked. Once his feet were firmly planted on the top of the rails, holding up the suspension railway, and allowing to bring people all over the station. This way, Reprieve replied, and took off straight ahead, which was one of the two ways they could possibly go. I can't believe I'm actually doing this. That makes two of us, James yelled back at him, looking down. Way down. Damn, they were high up. Didn't look this high from inside the train. However, the route served its purpose wonderfully. Up here they were nearly unreachable for all but gunfire, which was hopefully still out, or the craziest, most dedicated guards ever, which James hoped he could handle. If someone actually tried to fight him up here, no one could say it was his fault if that person took a dive downward. It would be basically inevitable. But while they may have been unreachable, they were certainly not invisible. In fact, they were quite easy to spot, sticking out like sore thumbs, being completely out of place. Which means they could keep the attention off themselves. Surely it would be a logical project to try and spread out, so there would always be someone ready to greet them, no matter where they decided to finally hop off, so to say. Come on, James thought to himself. You want me? I'm right here. Come and get me. Give it everything you got. No matter how this ends, I want to see you fucking try first.